These are the tales of one DM that could not get out of his own way and committed to ideas that destroyed both his game and his mental health. At this point, the players are pretty checked out, not even trying to get the DM to fix it, because they know that no matter what they say, the DM will take it personally and then punish them for it. So they're doing in-game what we are doing right now. Putting our feet up, sitting back, and watching the DM get crushed under the weight of his own terrible decisions and inability to learn. This is the finale of a two-part series. However, I'm gonna be honest with you, part 1 isn't super necessary. I would recommend it as I find it a funny video, but it's not super necessary. Think of the first part as the fuse and this part as the dynamite. You're still getting all of the boom right here and now. Anyways, sponsor time. I know what you're thinking. CritCrab, this gameplay is fire. What video game is this? I'm pleased to announce that this is not just any video game. This is actually a new software for online tabletop role-playing to take your visual experience to the next level. Goodbye basic white grids. Hello, one more multiverse. They are committed to making your TTRPG look and handle like a video game, while retaining the freedom and uniqueness inherent in tabletop role-playing games. You get the best of both, easily, but you're not so sure. You don't even know where you would start. Well, no worries, friend. They already have a game ready to go, Blades in the Dark. So rev up your player slayer, grab your friends, and go on an epic adventure you won't forget in the world of Blades. Link is in the description, see you there. That said, roll post. Before I begin this tale, I want to make it clear that Steve is not entirely at fault here. Granted, he should have stopped this about 5 minutes in, but this falls mostly on the shoulders of Mick and Pete. Mick was a political science major, and yes, the exact kind of poli-sci major you're imagining. The type who thought the height of economics is Reaganomics, and that poor people are just not trying hard enough. Pete was on the opposite end of the spectrum, but knew it was a good idea to not bring up politics at the gaming table. In this specific campaign, we were all basically playing ourselves, with Mick being a bard and Pete being a druid. The debate began on the astral plane, for some reason. We found an ancient black dragon skeleton coiled around a mostly destroyed clutch of eggs. One egg was left, and Pete quickly wrapped it up and said that he was going to raise it to be a pet for the party. Since we all trusted in his animal handling and didn't know anything about dragons in character, we agreed, all of us, except for Mick. Mick asked if he could roll a knowledge nature check about black dragons. Given that he was a bard, he scored high on the check, and Steve said he basically knew everything about them. Mick then stated that we should crush the egg because black dragons are, quote, inherently evil. This is where the DM could have prevented the entire horror story. Because the argument just started 1 second ago, it's especially easy to defuse now. Steve says, you know all about them. Mick runs with it and calls them evil. What Steve should have immediately done is agreed or disagreed. Just a simple little yup or nah would do. Leaving it up in the air and watching them start a fight is just stupid. It's just about to boil over, so roll post. Quick aside here, if this happened in one of my games nowadays, I would have quashed this because evil is not genetic. That's even in the rules for 5e, but in 3.5, monsters didn't say usually lawful evil or whatever, it just said alignment, lawful evil. This is what Mick was basing his argument on. Cue the start of a back and forth between Pete and Mick about nature versus nurture. When it comes to the alignment of monsters, the rest of us tried to interject, but one side would start it up again a few seconds later. Turning to Steve, he simply smiled and let it continue. He never got involved in party conflict unless fists were about to fly. Yeah, but that really doesn't apply here, does it? This isn't party conflict so much as it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the way Steve's world works. Are these still rules as written? Maybe, but he's incorporating so many other systems, it's impossible to tell what kind of dragon it even is. I don't even really blame the party for disagreeing. I do blame them for not immediately making the DM give them a straight answer though. It's not necessarily the DM's job to squash every single disagreement between party members. It is the DM's job to be the referee though. So if there is a disagreement on this level, the DM needs to step in. Some people might say, no CritCrab, it's okay to let them disagree and debate over this. It's actually a cool scene, them finding an egg, one argues to kill it, the other one argues to preserve its life. That's a good scene. I would normally agree with you. However, if the DM says, you know everything about these dragons, and then refuses to give a straight answer on such an important piece of information like whether or not the dragon can be used for good, shifts a pretty big piece of blame on his shoulders. Quickly, the argument turned from being strictly about alignment and turned into a proxy war of jabs at each other's philosophical worldviews. No one else at the table wanted to listen to this, but no one could force them to shut up. Neither wanted to leave things be, as the other party would see that as admitting defeat. No one else wanted to leave either because it was our one bi-weekly session that we could make. And we were technically making progress, just with this argument going on in the background. Now comes the horror part of this story. This argument that was the intellectual equivalent of Ben Shapiro and Mao Zedong arguing over the political beliefs of Elmo lasted the entire 3-hour session. You know what got accomplished? Nothing. Pete still had the egg and the party's stance had not changed. Mick only lasted one more session, saying that his character, quote, felt unsafe with the dragon and left. Steve never clarified the alignment of the dragon either, as the campaign ended a few sessions later before the egg could hatch. DMs, if your players start arguing about the ethics and nature of monsters, step in and stop it. Trust me, no one wants to suddenly listen to the Bill Nye versus Kent Hovind debate while trying to play D&D. At this point, I'm just gonna say everyone sucks here. The DM for not clarifying, and those two players for letting this go on as long as they did. As soon as they hit a firm disagreement and realized that they wouldn't convince each other, that's when you turn to the DM and say, hey, I succeeded my role, you're supposed to give me information now. Especially taking a good in-character argument that really explores the moral fiber of these characters, and then dragging it into the real world and just bullying each other and making everyone else uncomfortable makes them the bad guys too. Anyways, roll post. Edit. For those following the epic of Steve, you may be wondering why I was even playing with Steve at this point. Honestly, my friends and I kept going to sessions because we found them hilarious. Like in the way that a toddler babbling about a tea party is funny. Here be a tale of the one time I played in a Game of Thrones campaign. I can't remember the system exactly. It also doesn't end poorly. It's more the story of a DM getting his just desserts. This was prior to the explosion that was the TV show, so Steve was responsible for bringing us into the world. This included giving us pre-made characters so that we would fit the world, and I ended up with a Greyjoy Maester. The first session went by fine, with our party being brought into King's Landing after being selected by each of our houses to represent them at an event. The second session is where things go south. Turns out that the event was a tournament to the death. The Targaryen noble didn't have to participate because, well, she's a noblewoman, but everyone else was expected to participate in the death matches. As a maester, I had the combat ability of a blind kitten, so I asked what I could do that didn't involve me dying in one round. Steve tried to insist on me participating because I would be risking extreme dishonor, but I replied with, I would rather be dishonored than dead. After glaring, he finally agreed to let me have a stall on the pavilion to demonstrate my skills, but I would only have 2 silver left after paying the fees. It was also basically just a tent, a chair, and a table. I would have to supply my own things to sell. During the remainder of the session, I was basically treated like I wasn't there. Steve didn't even engage with me, so I drained my phone looking at dank memes. I show up to the next session and more of the same. I brought it up to Steve and he just said, "Oh, you should have been in the tournament." I hatched a plan in my head to at least make the session enjoyable for me. This is completely unsurprising. People who watched the last video will know that this was going to happen because this is what Steve does. If you even have the slightest idea for an adjustment or deviation from his idea, he'll let you do it. But before the conversation is over, he's already plotting ways to twist the game around to kill you off or make your character unplayable as a punishment for not following his plan. Me. Hey, Steve, before we get on to the next fight, can I clear up a couple things about what I'm doing? Yeah, I guess. So, I can make anything in the player's handbook while I'm at my stall, correct? If you could afford it, but you have to check if you can even buy the supplies here, which you probably won't be able to do. Okay, but if I already have the stuff, I can make it, right? Sure, whatever. Anything else? Will anyone buy anything from my stand? Roll for it. And I roll high on my salesmanship. People will buy whatever you have, but only at the listed cost. No, that works for me. During the rest of the session, I was again ignored, but I hatched a plan. In the handbook, there was a description of things you could craft, what materials you need, how long it took, and how much it sold for. Turns out that a spoon weighed slightly less than a piece of silver. I guess they're tiny teaspoons. All I would need for it was my tools because it was so low of a check to make a spoon that I couldn't fail. Additionally, a feature of my class was the ability to make masterwork items. They cost the same amount of materials and time, but sold for 200% of their normal cost. Finally, the time to craft a spoon was only about half an hour, so I could make a few in the 10-hour days I was being left alone for. So, for the next 8 in-game days, of which I was entirely ignored, I sat in my stall, hammering silver coins into masterwork spoons. I ended up making over 150 spoons and selling every single one of them. Everyone who was in King's Landing had a custom spoon in their pocket, and I had a ton of extra money. When the tournament was finally over, Steve asked me to fill the party in on what I had been doing. He lost his mind. He said that I had undermined the entire campaign. But the other players quickly reminded him that I asked him what I could do, and I followed the rules the entire time. Without a leg to stand on, he grumbled about it and had the guards seize all my silver as a tax on my stall. Our barbarian, who won the tournament, split his winnings with me after we left the city gates. After hearing of what I was doing, the noble in our party, who was also incredibly bored of the forced sidelining that Steve imposed on her as well, bestowed upon me the title of Spoon Man of the Iron Throne. The look on Steve's face whenever he was reminded to have his NPCs call me by my full title was worth 3 sessions of being ignored. I love this story. This is one of the funniest betrayals of a bad DM I have ever heard, and none of it is being a bad player. He was ignored for several sessions, told he could go build and sell items instead, and then the DM gets mad when he does it. Not to mention the absolute cherry on top being the title of Spoon Man of the Iron Throne. At first, I wasn't so sure why OP stuck around for as long as he did. Now though, I get it. I would have done the same just to see what happens. Honestly, I guess I'm not the good noodle I thought I was. Anyways, we're on the last story now. Roll post. This tale takes place during an extremely short-lived section of the epic that took place in space. We were all enlisted members of some space navy, with Steve having an NPC as the captain of our ship. The only other person of note here is Carmen, Steve's wife? Wait, he's married? She was playing an engineer, and her persona was very much a stereotypical, "it's not a phase, mom," cyberpunk character. Steve's captain was Zap Brannigan from Futurama, but no, he was just Zap Brannigan. From the first session, Steve started hitting on Carmen's character hard. He basically acted like their characters were married in-game, but Carmen was not having any of that. Carmen, in real life, was bisexual, and she wanted to explore that with her character. So in her backstory, she wrote in that she was a lesbian. Steve, or his character, I'm honestly not sure which, thought that his charisma could overcome her lesbianness, and that they could be a couple in the game. Carmen, obviously, was not happy, but she decided to just try and roleplay out of it. As a quick side note, Steve's dogged pursuit of his own wife basically left us to our own devices. The majority of 4 out of 5 sessions that we had were just looking up neat things in our vast array of 3.5 books, while Steve verbally drooled over his wife. It had kind of been normalized that Steve would ignore people that didn't fit his narrative at this point in the epic, so we just made sure to pay attention to the story and the crazy stuff. At first, it was just simply turning Steve down like a normal person would, politely but firmly, and getting less and less polite as time went on. Then she stepped it up by finding a girlfriend on the ship, moving all of her stuff to her quarters and essentially spending all of her time with them. Steve still would not get it and kept asking her to come up to his room, so she escalated. At a meeting that Steve's character was running, Carmen loudly interrupted and said, in case no one has noticed, I'm making out with my girlfriend in the corner. We all laughed, but Steve just didn't seem to get it and continued on with the meeting. Finally, after a couple weeks of in-game pushing, Carmen decided to do one of the most amazing feats of boss bitchery that I have yet to come across. She had asked our communication person, Pete from previous stories, to reroute the entire fleet's communication array to a portable camera she owned. She set it up in her girlfriend's quarters and began a long, scripted speech about how much of a lesbian she was and how nothing was going to change her. For about 15 uninterrupted minutes, we weren't going to stop this, and Steve seemed to want to hear this too for some reason. She described everything about her girlfriend that she loved, and how she was the complete opposite of Steve's captain. She also decided to read from her diary that she started keeping about every single time Steve had tried to sway her from her orientation. She then capped it off by proposing to her girlfriend on camera. Steve's character was humiliated. His character was, but not Steve himself. He then claimed that he had, quote, planned it all along, and the repeated sexual harassments and pressuring from a superior officer was all meant to push Carmen into being comfortable with herself. It was just a coincidence that he shut down that wing of the campaign immediately after that speech, and he hated us talking about it when he was around. The weirdest thing for me about all of this, Steve and Carmen are still married. As a final note, Steve clearly ran games that were playable, even at extremely ambitious scales. But he ultimately failed at every human aspect of DMing, which is the most important part. However, I will give him a 5 out of 10 on the technical aspect. He built systems so big that they couldn't work, and then forced them to. However, he was so concerned with whether or not he could, he never stopped to think whether or not he should. Till next time.